Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute. I am delighted to see you all here. Those whom I cannot see can see us because we are webcasting this, and we've also got the participation of our media partner, Politico. So they are beaming us out to parts unknown. I don't know if Politico's reach is quite stratospheric yet, but I suspect any day now they'll be launching Politico Mars. If you are here today, it is because of the vision and hard work of our North American Competitiveness Fellow, Lynn Platt, who I think has talked to everyone involved in U.S. Canada space work. So thank you, Lynn, and to our tremendous team at the Canada Institute, Savannah, Mariana. We would not be here at the Wilson Centre if not for the vision and the boundless energy of our president and CEO, Jane Harman. So I am going to turn the podium and the program over to Jane so she can have a conversation with Jim Bridenstine, and I look forward to hearing what they're saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I was just chatting with Jim about life after Congress. It's real good. But to those of our former colleagues who still labor there, it would be my wish, and I'm sure he shares it, that the place would become more productive on a bipartisan basis. And space is one of the areas, fortunately, where there has been, certainly over the years, or at least the years that I know about, bipartisan cooperation, and that is welcome and important. So now let's brag about Laura. The Wilson Center's Canada Institute is the only place, in Washington dedicated to studying the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States. Directed by Laura Dawson, its excellence is one of the reasons why our peers voted the Wilson Center the best regional studies think tank in the world out of 6,500 think tanks. But we're not bragging. As a space chick, that would be me at heart, I'm thrilled to open a conference on a good news story in the U.S.-Canada relationship. As I always used to say, I represented the Aerospace Center of the Universe in Southern California over 9 terms in Congress. Yes, the fantastic weather makes for good launches, but it's also where so many of our satellites and rockets are built. The close proximity to the Jet Propulsion Lab and Caltech, and most of the aerospace companies you've ever heard of also helped. My first committee assignment in Congress was on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, which has jurisdiction over NASA. And I co-chaired what was then called the Space Caucus, it may still be there, with a guy named John Kyle. Ever heard of him? Well, he went on to a kind of dull career as a U.S. Senator, and this week left the Senate, retired with great accolades, and then left the Senate, and this week was named to fill the McCain vacancy until the next election. I emailed him on the day that I read the news 2 days ago and said, "Want coffee?" And his response was, "Yes, soon." So I look forward to that. But back to Canada. Did you know that our 2 countries have signed a bilateral framework agreement on space? Most of you knew because we have the smartest audiences at the Wilson Center, but maybe somebody tuning in didn't know that. Did you know that NASA and the Canadian Space Agency have collaborated closely for decades? From the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to the International Space Station to hard science innovations like the Canadarm robotic arm that supported numerous outer space missions, our 2 nations are doing great things together. You should also know that the Canadian astronaut who is now Governor General of Canada, Julie Payette, was, are you ready? A Wilson Center scholar here in 2010 to 2011. Of course, that's why she has this next big job. And while we're talking about Wilson scholars, Jim didn't know this, Chris Davenport, who will moderate a panel later today, just wrote a blockbuster book called Space Barons. Where? Here at the Wilson Center. Recommended reading for all of you. It's exciting that the Trump administration has made space policy a priority, putting the National Space Council back in business with Vice President Mike Pence as chairman, and by creating a Space Force. I'm sure we'll discuss that in a few minutes. And as you will hear, no doubt, from the administrator, this renewed government focus is already having spin-off effects for commercial activity in space. Many of you are connected to commercial activity, such as private companies who provide the payload services for space missions, and companies like Iridium, which has just launched its next generation of satellites. The U.S. and Canada are allies on land, in the oceans, and in space, and surely in the intelligence space, something I know quite a bit about. And I am pleased to welcome the large Canadian delegation that is joining us here today, especially Sylvain Laporte, who will speak next, who is the president of the Canadian Space Agency. But before we hear the Canadian perspective, I'm honored to be hosting a conversation with the fairly newly minted and recent escapee from the United States Congress, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. He might not put it that way, but I just did. Who was sworn in as the agency's 13th administrator on April 23rd, 2018. That does seem long ago. A fellow recovering politician, he served as a member of Congress from Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District for 3 terms. We didn't overlap, sadly, where he was a member of, guess what, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Before being elected to Congress, he served as an aviator in the U.S. Navy and as the executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum and Planetarium. Please join me in welcoming NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who will make some brief remarks, and then we'll have a brief conversation and include, I think, a few questions from you.
Jane, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for your leadership here. It is absolutely true, and I agree with you that I am an escapee, the same as you, and I am glad to be leading NASA and not in the House of Representatives today. So as much as I enjoyed my time there, I'm having a lot more fun in the executive branch than in the legislative branch. But what an honor to be here to talk about the cooperation between NASA and the Canadian Space Agency. And I want to start by saying thank you to Sylvain Laporte. We had a great conversation yesterday, and we're looking forward to a long and very collaborative relationship as it relates to space, as we always have. In fact, from the very beginning of NASA, we were cooperating with Canada on a whole host of capabilities and missions. A lot of people may not realize Canada has been very interested in space really going back to the 1800s because of the aurora. And Canada was actually the nation that first started thinking about the fact that the aurora actually correlates with solar particles coming from the sun. We talk about solar flares. We talk about coronal mass ejections and how that affects ultimately the aurora that is so visible in Canada. And the confluence of those activities with the magnetic spectrum, surrounding the globe. So all of these things go back all the way to the 1800s, and Canada has been leading the way on these kind of activities to include understanding the ionosphere. And the United States, of course, has been excited about partnering with Canada on all these scientific discoveries going back all of these years. So it's great to be here. In fact, the very first satellite ever built that wasn't an American satellite or a Russian satellite was a Canadian satellite, which is impressive in itself, the Alouette 1, which in fact was launched by the United States of America. So that shows going back, I think it was 1962, when we actually collaborated on that particular project. Today, and I've got a note here, our history has almost 500 agreements in our history. And today, we have agreements on 46 projects currently underway between the United States and Canada. So what a great relationship for such a long period of time that has been important for science for the entire planet. What NASA has done with the Canadian Space Agency has been fantastic. One of the most important missions we have underway right now is the Mars Curiosity rover. And when I say it's one of the most important missions, since I've been the NASA administrator, which is only 4 months now, some amazing discoveries have taken place. The idea that we have complex organic molecules on the surface of Mars is now understood because of the Mars Curiosity rover. It's also understood that the methane cycles on Mars are perfectly in line with the seasons of Mars. And these discoveries have been made really just since the last 4 months since I've been the NASA, so I take full credit for these discoveries. But the reason these discoveries have been made is because of an instrument suite on the Mars Curiosity rover. One of those instruments is what's called the alpha particle X-ray spectrometer. So the alpha particle X-ray spectrometer is a device created by the Canadian Space Agency that helps us understand the materials on the surface of Mars. So when you think of an alpha particle, you think about a helium nucleus, if you will, so 2 protons and 2 neutrons. That's an alpha particle. And then you take a radioactive element, curium, and it creates X-rays. And then these X-rays, which is really just electromagnetic radiation, working with these alpha particles, and then you take an element from the surface of Mars and you put it in the mix, and it interacts in a way that ultimately discharges electrons, creates other X-rays that are then measured by this device created by the Canadian Space Agency, and you can make determinations from this particular capability. You can make determinations on the elements on the surface of Mars. And it is a piece of our understanding that we now know there are complex organic molecules on the surface of Mars. People are, well, what does that mean? It doesn't guarantee that life existed on Mars or that maybe life exists today. It doesn't guarantee it. But what it does is it increases the probability that life may have existed at one time and may even exist today. And now we know, because of a discovery even a month ago, we know that there is liquid water 1.5 kilometers below the surface of Mars. So you take all of these things and you start adding it up, and it's starting to look like, not that there's life, I'm not saying there's life, but what I'm saying is, I want to be really clear, because I know there's media in the room and they are looking for me to make an announcement here. But the probability of life is going up because of the discoveries made, of course, by NASA with our counterparts there at the Canadian Space Agency. Also, the OSIRIS-REx mission. So right now we've got a probe going out to an asteroid called Bennu, and we're going to try to learn as much as we can about this particular asteroid. And OSIRIS-REx has a laser altimeter on board, so that in December, when we approach Bennu, which is going to happen this year, we're going to approach Bennu in deep space, an asteroid. We're going to use that laser altimeter created by the Canadian Space Agency to make determinations on the shape and really map the surface of this particular asteroid so we can understand its characterization even more. On Earth science, we've got CloudSat historically, which we've been very cooperative on engaging, trying to understand how clouds affect how the climate is changing and the temperature changes on the surface of the planet. And of course, the surface water ocean topography mission, which is going to be coming up in the year 2021, which is a great collaboration between NASA and the Canadian Space Agency. Then, of course, there are the most salient aspects of what Canada does with the United States. Mark Garneau is Canada's first astronaut and the current Minister of Transport in the Government of Canada. And he's one of so many astronauts. I think there's been a total of 8 astronauts that have come from Canada so far, and there's more to come. It was already mentioned Julie Pyatt, a former Canadian astronaut, and now the Governor General of Canada, operated the Canada arm from inside the space station to perform the first manual docking of Space Shuttle Discovery on the International Space Station, another monumental achievement. And of course, we're looking forward to the next Canadian astronaut, David St. Jakes. So that's going to be fun in the future. So we've got this long history and this collaboration and cooperation that goes back decades, in fact, to the very beginning of NASA. And we look forward to continuing it. And there's so much more we can do, and we're going to be able to do so much more together than we could ever do apart. And we think about what the future holds. We had a great conversation yesterday about the Gateway. The president he put out Space Policy Directive 1. He says we're going to the moon. We're going to go differently than we've ever gone before. We're going to go sustainably, which means we've got to have reusability. Launch vehicles, we now understand launch vehicles. When they're reused, cost goes down, access goes up. We need every aspect of the architecture between the Earth and the Moon to be reusable, to include tugs that go from Earth orbit to lunar orbit. And we need a space station, if you will. Think of a reusable service module in orbit around the Moon, a reusable command module in orbit around the Moon. We call it the gateway. We need it to be there for a long period of time. It needs to be capable of hosting humans, but also it needs to be able to work uncrewed. And of course, how is it going to work uncrewed? Well, we need to take advantage of some of the great capabilities that Canada has developed. The people are familiar with the Canada arm on the International Space Station and on the space shuttles. Well, we can hopefully maybe one day have an agreement where we can have a Canada arm, no kidding, on Gateway, not only on the outside but on the inside, and have it more robust than ever before so that it can, in fact, help manage the space station when it is uncrewed, which means we're going to have to include pieces of artificial intelligence embedded in the Gateway. These are all kind of things that we're thinking about in the future to make our access to the Moon sustainable for the long term. We don't want flags and footprints on the surface of the Moon and then come home and never go back. What we want to do is establish a continual opportunity to go back and forth, utilize the resources of the Moon, and to do it in a way that is sustainable. So with Canada by our side, we're going to be able to achieve those very impressive capabilities, and I look forward to a very robust future. So with that, Jane, I'll open it up to you to ask questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I was sitting here thinking, Jim, that one of the wonderful things about space, or the conversations around space, is that they're hopeful.
They are.
And so little in the news cycle these days, just saying, is hopeful.
And bipartisan.
Uh-huh,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's right. You didn't describe, if there's life on Mars, you didn't give it a party label.
That's right.
If there is life on Mars. So I was recalling a couple things. First of all, I remember, President Kennedy's challenge that we needed to go to the Moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard.
Yes.
And isn't it, exciting to think about tackling hard problems?
That's exactly right.
And so I just mentioned that. The other thing that I remembered was when I was on the science committee, a guy named George Brown, who was a congressman from California, a very progressive Democrat, was the chairman. And he was extremely interested in science. And he used to say, in my next life, I want to be the fat old guy floating around in Earth orbit. And it was bizarre, but the point was he was, and some in Congress still are, and certainly you are, in love with the space mission.
Absolutely.
So I mentioned to you that there have been some initiatives under the Trump administration, including the revival of the Space Council, which Mike Pence chairs, and of which you are a member, and the creation, it hasn't happened yet, but the recommendation that a Space Force be created. Can you explain to us what these things will add?
Sure. So the National Space Council, a lot of people, when they think about space, they think about NASA, or they think about the Department of Defense. But now space consumes so much more of not only government, but also commercial enterprise, that it's not just NASA and it's not just Department of Defense. The Department of Transportation is involved in licensing launches and re-entry for commercial capabilities. The Department of Commerce ultimately licenses remote sensing capabilities through NOAA. And of course, NOAA itself has a very robust, capability in space. I was on the science committee, as were you, and I chaired the subcommittee on the environment. And in that role, I oversaw NOAA. Right. And 40% of NOAA's budget is space-related activities that help us understand how, weather. And the guy from Oklahoma, weather's pretty important.
Yeah, more important than ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Given the changes in climate.
Absolutely. So what we have to do is understand that space is a lot bigger than NASA and the Department of Defense. It's international, it's commercial, and of course there's all these new capabilities that we want to enable. So what the National Space Council does, and of course you've got the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, NASA, transportation, commerce, and Homeland Security. You've got all these heads of agencies on the National Space Council. What we do is we come together and we think about space not as NASA or the DoD or Homeland Security. We think about space as the American space enterprise, and how, if we wanted to maximize the utility of space for the United States, how would we do that? So it's a collaborative, interagency kind of capability that, as you mentioned, is chaired by the Vice President.
And I would think with his chairing it, and he's very interested in space.
Very much so.
That would make a
to
difference.
say the least.
He and I also overlapped in Congress for a decade.
Yes. Yeah, and he's been great for NASA.
Yeah, well, I'm on the Defense Policy Board, and clearly, if you really want to understand the defense mission, you have to understand the role that space plays, especially in the way the U.S.
That's right.
manages its whole defense mission. So I think that's a very welcome development. Now, what about the Space Force, which is, at least was, somewhat controversial?
Yeah.
Why do we need a new bureaucracy? Don't we already focus on space and so forth?
Absolutely. So when I talk about the Space Force, number one, I like to start by letting people know that NASA does science, we do discovery, we do exploration. We don't do national security or defense, and that's been the design since its inception in 1958. It was intentionally designed so that we could partner with the international community in ways that the DoD might not be able to partner, because we don't do national security, we don't do defense. So that's an important thing that we need to maintain. It's also important to note that when I was in the House of Representatives, we actually voted on the Space Force. I was on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, on the Armed Services Committee. Then on the full Armed Services Committee, we voted on the Space Force. In each case, it passed strong bipartisan support. And then on the full floor of the House, it was in the National Defense Authorization Act, and it passed the full floor of the House with 344 votes. So again, it showed strong bipartisan support. Now, it didn't pass in the Senate, and so it doesn't exist as of yet. But I'll share with you kind of what we were thinking at the time, and you were on the Intel committee, so you back in 2011, I think, is when you retired, and things were active then as they are now. When you think about what space is to the United States of America, the way we communicate, right? Some people are probably watching this on television. Maybe they have DirecTV, maybe they have Dish Network, maybe they're listening to it on XM radio, right. Maybe they're watching it on the internet and they get their broadband from space. The way we communicate has been transformed by space activities. The way we navigate, the way we produce food. I was at a swim meet for my kids the other day, and there was a swimmer there. Our kids are in elementary school, but the grandfather of one of the kids was a farmer from Nebraska, and he asked me. He said, so what do you do? And I said, well, I work for NASA. And he says, well, what do you do for NASA? I said, well, I'm the administrator. And he says, well, what does the administrator do? I said, well, I'm kind of in charge of it. And it was one of those moments where as soon as he realized that, he wanted to tell me all of the ways that in Nebraska they're increasing their crop yields based on technology developed by NASA. He wanted to make sure I was aware. And of course, I was aware on a surface level, but boy, he went into depth and started sharing. They've got a consortium now in Nebraska where they're sharing information with other farmers to make sure the eco-stress kind of capabilities that NASA developed are getting out to all the farmers to increase crop yields to feed more of the world than ever before. And so the way, and I kind of got off on a tangent, but the way we communicate, the way we navigate, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we do national security and defense, the way we do disaster relief, the way we predict weather, the way we understand climate. A lot of people don't realize you get up in the morning, you turn on the TV, you see the green blob on the TV screen, whatever channel you're watching, that green blob, you know what time the weather's going to be over your neck of the woods. That green blob, 80% of that data comes from space and goes into numerical weather models.
But all of that is the good news story.
That's
but
right.
The bad news story is our space assets also are vulnerable.
Very vulnerable.
And if they go down,
Yeah.
Let's just imagine an attack from some bad guy someplace, then what?
That's the point. And all those good news stories, where it gets even more concerning is GPS. The timing signal from GPS is required for every banking transaction. It's required for timing of flows of spectrum on the electromagnets for terrestrial wireless networks, for example, cell phones. It's required for the flows of electricity on the power grid. So again, if we lose those capabilities, it is an existential threat to the United States of America. And the enemies of the United States, without going into details about what they're doing.
Not including Canada.
Right. Let me just say, not the enemies. I'm gonna rephrase that. The potential adversaries of the United States have looked at space and declared it the American Achilles heel, because they know if it is destroyed, it will wreck the United States of America. Now, all that being said, what we have to do as a country, and you know, the Wilson Center is, you know, a great institution to help us get out this message. We have to make it such that the potential adversaries of the United States look at space and they see that there's no possible way they're going to get an advantage by destroying it.
Right.
And if we can do that, then we can preserve space for generations to come and improve the human condition for everybody on the globe. But if we neglect our responsibility to make sure space is secure, then it will be a vulnerability, and that in itself is provocative. So that's my thought on it.
So one last question, and then maybe we could take two together. One question from the audience. Laura, please, can we do that? Or two questions combined? Okay. So my last question is about what are we doing, and do we have enough money on the case? Are we hardening the right stuff? And with respect to commercial assets in space, which I know something about, and the redundancy that they create, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Is NASA embracing, because some aren't, I'm
Right.
not saying you aren't, sharing space
Absolutely.
with commercial space assets?
100%. So when we think about the future and the cost and the things that are happening in space, NASA has a big, we are very interested in making sure space is secure, because we have astronauts on board the International Space Station. We have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets in space. We need it to be secure. The Department of Defense is building resiliency into their architectures. Part of that resiliency includes distributing space-based architectures. So we have a lot of small satellites complicating the targeting solution for the enemies, and not building massive Battlestar Galactica satellites where you
Right.
put every sensor onto one particular. But there's a whole host of distribution that not only includes space-based, but terrestrial and airborne distribution of the architecture to make sure that it is secure. From NASA's perspective, again, we don't do national security or defense, but we're glad that people do national security and defense, and again, make it such that the United States is not vulnerable.
Yeah, but you just explained that GPS is a crucial part of both the defense space and the non-defense space.
It is.
In space.
And our adversaries are building their own GPS constellations at the same time they're launching anti-satellite missiles and other things. So the question is, why would they do that when the GPS signal is available to everybody in the world for free?
So I have permission to combine two short questions into one question. Please identify yourself and ask one short question, right in the middle here. I'm sure there's a microphone.
There's a microphone running down to you.
Running. She's running. Run. Run. Okay.
Michael Byers, University of British Columbia. Administrator Bridenstine, one thing you didn't mention was space debris.
Yeah, it's a
Ah.
big
And the
deal.
Good.
Kessler syndrome, Donald Kessler, a NASA scientist who identified this risk in 1978. How does the issue of the securitization of space relate to the risk of runaway space debris, and how concerned is NASA and the U.S. military about this problem?
Great question. One more question. Back. Laura recognized somebody. Who did you recognize? Right there. Yes? Okay.
Thank you.
So I saw a woman's face and a man's hand, so I called him a lady. I apologize.
Sorry. John Newman, NIH, retired. Given the importance of asteroids in the history of our planet, where do we stand currently in terms of asteroid detection?
That's a great question.
Okay, so space junk and asteroids.
No, this is all and these are not dissimilar kind of questions. They kind of relate to each other. So NASA is one of 13 agencies that's part of what we call the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, and as this one of 13 agencies involved in this around the globe, it has been determined that every 5 to 9 years on average, we're going to have a collision in space, in low Earth orbit specifically, similar to the Iridium Cosmos collision that happened back in 2009. So that being said, each one of those collisions results in thousands of pieces of orbital debris that are trackable. And then that means there's thousands of pieces that are not trackable, too small to be tracked. And of course, each one of those collisions begets more collisions. Now, the study said, based on current launch cadence, that is going to be a risk every 5 to 9 years. And It could get to a runaway syndrome. You talked about the Kessler syndrome. We're not there yet. We're going to do everything we can to make sure we don't get there, but that is a concern that we need to be preparing for today to make sure that we don't ever get there. Okay, that being the case, it's also important to note that right now the way it works is all of the data that we use for doing conjunction analysis and warning comes from the Joint Space Operations Center at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is a mission of Strategic Command, which is a joint command. But at the end of the day, it's all coming from the Department of Defense. So in 2007, China launched a direct ascent anti-satellite missile. They hit one of their own weather satellites. They created a debris field of thousands of pieces of orbital debris. And our JSPOC, the Joint Space Operations Center, is responsible for tracking all of that debris. Now, it used to be that they would send information to China about where all that debris is. Now China is actually reaching back to the United States saying, help us, because now they have their own taikonaut program, their own taikonauts on their own space stations, and they're worried about their own taikonauts. And so now they're coming to the United States and saying, we want more information on the orbital debris. So this is a challenge. Here's the issue. Right now, the United States taxpayer is doing space situational awareness and space traffic management for the entire world for free. And as you mentioned, which is an important point, you talked about the future. I think, I don't remember how you framed it, but the idea that we're going to have a future where there's going to be a lot more launches upcoming. Right. The study said, if launches stay the same, this is the future that we're going to have to deal with. The reality is, because of I think you said the collateralization of space, because of that, we're seeing private capital come into space activities in ways we've never seen before, and we're seeing low Earth orbit communication constellations that are going to be launched that have thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit, which our calculations have not calculated for this activity, and not just one company with thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit for low latency, high throughput communications. Think of basically having thousands of cell towers in low Earth orbit.
And think of decommissioning old satellites and what to do with them and how to get them out of orbit and get them to hopefully.
Absolutely. So we have to solve this issue. So Space Policy Directive 3, which came from the National Space Council, it does focus on space situational awareness and space traffic management specifically. It puts it at the Department of Commerce, and so we're moving out on those activities right now at the Department of Commerce. NASA is going to be involved in helping create the technologies and the capabilities and then turning it over to Commerce. NASA does not want to get involved in being the traffic cop for space activity because we're not a regulator, we're a science and exploration kind of agency. But Commerce can and should do that activity, and we support that.
Okay, so asteroids.
So this is another big concern. So we've had a mandate from Congress for a number of years now to find the largest asteroids that could be damaging to planet Earth and categorize them and catalog them. And we've been doing that. And at this point, I can't remember what the specific number is, but of all the asteroids that could be damaging to Earth, we believe, we assess that we have catalogs, over 90% of any asteroids that could be in orbit, heliocentric orbit around the sun that could cross the Earth's orbit. We believe we're in good shape there. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to have asteroids run into Earth, but we have that every night. If you just look up at the night sky, you'll see meteorites hitting the atmosphere. All that being said, the ones that could be damaging to Earth, we believe we've got cataloged, and we're in good shape for a long time.
Well, challenges to come, but I must say that having a well-informed, bipartisan voice as the head of NASA is a very good thing, especially someone who's very friendly to Canada.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Jane. That was excellent. I appreciate that. Wasn't that great? I could sit here just listening to them all morning. But it turns out that we have a jam-packed program, and it's an excellent program. And so my directions say riff a bit about the Canada Institute while we invite Mac Evans and Sylvain Laporte to take the stage with me. So I don't have to riff too much. First of all, thank you. I am so grateful that we are not talking about NAFTA this morning. That's my usual domain, and this is a delight to be talking about something else entirely. I'm also really pleased that Jim was talking about, and Jane was talking about the Canadarm. I'm a Canadian. A good friend of mine is an American, and he uses Canadarm as a meme for that thing that Canadians do. And if there's Americans here, you know what I mean. It's like when you're watching something, you're listening to something on the radio or TV, it's Saturday Night Live, and a Canadian says, you know what, Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels, he's a Canadian. Or you're listening to the radio, American Woman. Yeah, hear that song? That's a Canadian. So my friend uses Canadarm as the meme for all things important, uniquely Canadian that our American friends don't know about. And I think it's also a good analogy for what we're talking about here today, in that, Canada comes to the table. We don't bring a lot of flash, but we bring things that are uniquely important. We bring things that require a lot of technology, and we work very, very well with our American partners. So while we are waiting for our panel to make their way down the hallway, and it's a crowded hallway, I will continue riffing. There's a VIP board back there that when our speakers come in, Henry Kissinger, presidents, members of Congress, etc. On the VIP board, we have signatures, and so at the top of as we were coming in this morning, we gave Mr. Bridenstine a marker to sign the VIP board, and we directed him, Henry Kissinger, members of Congress, Canadian Minister Sajjan, Harjit Sajjan, down around the logo, but the NASA administrator signed right up on top. So there we go. Have I had a chance to thank, it's gone now, but let me thank them again. Maxar Technologies, who they are our event sponsor today, and we're very, very pleased to have them on board. Can I say that again? Thank you, Maxar Technologies. All right, so we've done the American administrator presentation, and now we're moving on to the Canadian administrator presentation. So what we've got today for the Canadian contribution is we have, of course, Sylvain Laporte, who is the president of the Canadian Space Agency, but he's going to be introduced by Mac Evans, who, if you know anything about space in Canada, you know Mac Evans. I'm going to give the introduction to Mac, and then Mac is going to give the introduction to Sylvain. Is that correct, Lynn? Have I got that? See, I can't do anything without her. And then we're ready to roll. So Mac Evans. To say that Mac Evans has a long experience in Canada-U.S. space issues is a vast understatement. He was instrumental in getting the Canadian Space Agency established in 1989. He became CSA's vice president that year and was responsible for Canada's participation in the International Space Station, the RadarSat program, and the Canadian Astronaut program. And in 1994, he became CSA's third president, serving until 2001. He is, among his numerous honors, he's a member of the Order of Canada, inducted for his accomplishments in the Canada Space Program. On this side of the border, he is a lifetime director of the Space Foundation of the United States, and he received NASA's Distinguished Public Service Medal. Very cool. He currently provides consulting services to the Canadian space industry. He's chair of the Defense Advisory Board and a member of the Space Advisory Board. And he seems to be right here, right now. That's excellent. So please join me in welcoming, before I'm going to say that, and then you're going to applaud. But before I say that, let me give you a little order of procedure. So I've introduced Mac. Mac is going to introduce Mr. Laporte. And let's see, Mr. Evans is going to speak for 10 minutes, and Mr. Laporte is going to speak for 15, 20 minutes. And maybe we'll have some questions afterwards. So now we're all with the program. Please join me in welcoming Mac Evans.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it is really a pleasure here to be able to talk a bit. I've been asked to give some history of Canada-U.S. cooperation before I introduce Sylvain, so I'm going to go quickly through that. And first of all, I want to thank the Wilson Center for holding this conference, because I think it's quite timely. And I also note that in the title for the conference, there's a question mark at the end of it. And I don't know if it shows up here.
Yeah.
It is on Sylvan's
A
slide.
new era.
So it's obviously, this is not a statement that there is a new era. This is a question: is there a new era? So before we talk about the new era and all the panels that are going to follow, I would like to give just a bit of a background on how did we get to where we are here. So as you've heard, Canada's had a long cooperative relationship with the United States in space. In fact, it precedes the Sputnik era. And there's something that occurred back in 1957 called the International Geophysical Year. And Canada and the United States worked together to create the Churchill Rocket Research Range, which is up in northern Manitoba. And through that cooperation, with Canada and the United States putting the effort into making that into a rocket range, 45% of the U.S. rockets that were launched during the International Geophysical Year were launched from Churchill. And we're quite proud of that. But that is what got us started with our relationship with the United States. This precedes NASA, as the administrator said. In 1958, NASA was formed in response to the Sputnik launch. And as a matter of specific policy, international cooperation is one of the major objectives of NASA. And they invited international participation in their science program. That's what led to the Alouette satellite that the administrator mentioned earlier. Canada took up that offer because of our interest in the ionosphere, as he noted, and we created 4 satellites in that series. And as I go through this list, it's not so important the dates, but it is important to understand that each one of these relationships had a specific mode of operation, and they're different, and they suit the particular program in question. So, for the Alouette ISIS program, Canada built the satellites, the United States launched the satellites, and we shared the data. So that's how that one worked. And then Canada became more and more interested in communications into the northern parts of Canada. It was a difficult thing. HF radio was the only way of doing it, but with the advent of the space era, we now had the ability to do it by space. And so Canada and the United States embarked on a cooperative communications satellite program we call it CTS. It was ATS-6 in the U.S. parlance. And again, Canada built the satellite, but this time the United States provided a particularly important part of that satellite. The United States launched it, and then we shared the use of the satellite 50%. That satellite pioneered the 12-14 gigahertz band, so that was a common interest. In 1974, Canada issued its first policy on space, and the key element of that was international cooperation. Canada is a small nation, and so we recognized back in the early days of our space activities that international cooperation was really the only way in which we could proceed with the space program. Practically everything we have done since has been done with international cooperation. That policy led to 2 significant things. It led to Canada seeking and being given membership in the European Space Agency, and it is the foundational policy document that allowed the Canadarm program to proceed. The rationale there was that the feeling was that we needed to participate in the programs of launching countries so that we could ensure access to space, and that's how Canadarm was approved in Canada. Following the Canadarm success, the United States very generously offered Canada to fly 2 astronauts, and Mark Garneau, of course, was the first one, and Roberta Bonder was the second, and then we've had many, many more since. Then we moved along to the space station program, and it's important for everyone to understand that the space station program, this is my view, and I think it's collaborated, the space station program was a major foreign policy initiative of the United States. At that time, the Russians were launching foreign astronauts on their system, And Ronald Reagan was looking for a way to show the world that the Western nations could cooperate openly and demonstrate the value of our way of life. And so if you look at the things that Ronald Reagan did, and we're in the Ronald Reagan Center, he took the idea of a space station to the G7 summits. He took it, he nominated the administrator of NASA to be an ambassador at large, to go around at the diplomatic level and talk to nations about cooperation in space. And if you listen to his speeches, the reason that the United States wanted to do space station was to strengthen peace, build prosperity, and expand freedom. So then I spent the next 2 years of my life coming back and forth between Washington and Ottawa, negotiating the Canadian participation in the International Space Station. This particular cooperation reached the level of an international treaty. So we have another example of how international cooperation can take place. On this particular program, each of the participating nations owns and operates and maintains their contribution to the space station. So this is an entirely new and different way of international cooperation. It is my view that the real value of the International Space Station is it has shown that the nations of the world have learned how to live and work in space together. And as we think about other things, the Gateway and missions to Mars, it's the international cooperation has to be a fundamental tenet of those activities, and Space Station has pioneered the way. Another form of cooperation occurred in 1994, and this is at a period when the United States Congress was thinking of withdrawing from Space Station. This is the time when Canada was having second thoughts about Space Station. And there was a document signed, it's called the Evans-Clark Agreement. And it was comprehensive in scope. And what it was an attempt to codify and agree on international cooperation between Canada and the United States, actually between the Canadian Space Agency and NASA. And it covered a whole host of things. It covered space science, it covered communications, it covered Earth observation, and astronaut flights. And it became the fundamental document that allowed Canada to have its long-term space plan, which included RADARSAT-2, astronaut flights, SciSat, and of course our participation on Space Station. And we had then gone on to other things that you've heard about from the administrator, the James Webb Space Telescope. We are a key player in that in terms of providing the fine guidance system. But the thing I want to make is that these are all government-to-government cooperative arrangements. And they were done in an era where there were expanding budgets in Canada and there were expanding budgets in the United States. We are now in a different era. We have the commercialization space is taken off, as we all know. We have new clients for space systems every day, which are not governmental. Governments are moving from the business of owning and operating their own space systems to buying services from the commercial sector. We have the so-called new space environment where companies are raising substantial capital in the open markets to build systems to provide services to their customers. In my view, this new environment for space means that we have to think carefully about the types of cooperation that we're going to have in the future. And my challenge for the conference really is, hopefully with the people that are here, we'll be able to start to identify areas for future cooperation that bear in mind that we have to operate not only at the government level, we have to operate at the commercial level, and we have to operate at the industry level. And so those are the challenges that I sort of toss out to you. I think we need to start identifying ways of cooperation that capture the enthusiasm and the financial resources of the new space environment. We have to look at ways and means of ensuring that our procurement systems and our regulatory systems foster the cooperation that I think we all see as a benefit. So in conclusion, there is a strong base of history for Canada-U.S. cooperation in space. You heard it earlier today. There is a whole new space environment, which is with us now and is only going to become more and more important. I think this conference is important because it brings together in one day people, leaders from academia, industry, and government to talk about how we can expand and create this new era for international cooperation between Canada and the United States in space. So it's a very timely conference, and I'm looking forward to listening to the debates and the discussion that are to follow. So now it is my task, my pleasant task, to introduce the current president of the Canadian Space Agency, Sylvain Laporte. Sylvain has a Bachelor of Science degree in Computing Science, a Master's in Computer Engineering. He's had, I think, 3 careers, I'll put it this way. He spent his first career, 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as an aerospace engineer. When he retired from there, he moved career number 2 is he joined our Department of Industry in Canada, and where he was the Executive Director of Industrial Technologies and eventually the CEO of the Canadian Intellectual Property Office. So he's gathered quite a bit of a technical background there. And his third career now is as president of the CSA, which he's held since March of 2015. You're close to becoming the second longest reigning president of the Canadian Space Agency. So Sylvain brings extensive management and technical skills to the job. He is a key leader of the space activities in Canada, and his enthusiasm and his interest you'll are about to see. So Sylvain, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here this morning. And I stand in awe of the previous presentators. I thought that Jane and Jim did a fantastic job of talking about very, very complex subjects. And in fact, admittedly, and I say this with all humility, I've had a number of people try to explain to me the complexities of the APXS. Remember that alpha particle discussion that Jim mentioned this morning? So I've had my folks try to explain to me, and remember, I'm an engineer. So, you know, and I couldn't get it, and then so I asked the university folks, the PI, to come and explain the instrument to me as well. And you know that feeling when, or you've seen it as well, if you've seen a puppy hear a noise for the first time, and they sort of, you know, I had that feeling that's how I was reacting when people were explaining the APXS to me, and then when Jim mentioned it this morning, I got it. Right, so clearly a very good talent there with respect to explaining very complex things so that people can understand. And I stand also in awe when, you know, I follow Mac. I'm a fan of history. I'm a history buff, and particularly when it comes to space. And I'm always amazed to learn about, you know, all of the history that Mac has got in his head. And I would highly, highly recommend that somehow, Mac, you find a way to put that to paper and maybe publish a book sometime. That would be great. So here I am today talking to you with respect to the Canada-U.S. relationship. And you know, there's been quite a number of statements made so far this morning, and I'm going to echo a number of them already. But in the U.S. as well as in Canada, you know, we consider this relationship to be a very, very good illustration of how two countries can collaborate successfully together. So despite any kind of anxieties that may have traversed over time, over the past few decades, we can always look back to space and say, you know what, despite some of our differences, either between us or with other nations, we've always found a way to cooperate and to work properly in space. So thank you, Mac, for the great introduction. Laura, congratulations, you know, the best think tank out of 6,500. You know, in the day where we figure out which restaurant we're going to go eat at, and you go through TripAdvisor and you look at the ratings, or you look at your hotels and you look at the ratings, somehow you got to invent some kind of think tank TripAdvisor equivalent, you know, and then we'd be humbled to find that we're sitting here with the number one, right?
Yeah,
Usually
leave us
we-
a good Yelp review before you go.
All right, so, well then, distinguished guests, and we do have in the audience as well some Canadian members of the Space Advisory Board, so welcome to you as well. We have at the foundation a very country space policy, a vision. In the case of the U.S., it really is a very ambitious vision. Once again, our American colleagues are charting a clear and robust vision for the future of space exploration that will inspire others to rise to the challenge. For decades, Canada has been a partner to the U.S. in all manners of space activities. I'd like to thank the Wilson Centre for creating this timely event, focused on the future of Canada-U.S. collaboration in this dynamic sector. Timely, because space is changing, as Mac alluded to. The changes are dramatic, and they are accelerating, and all for the good. When it comes to the global space sector, economy, technology, and science are coming together as never before. This is a result of both a strategic move by government, the U.S. being very influential in leading the way, but also an organic move where more and more countries have understood the value of investing in space. Just over a decade ago, in 2006, 47 countries were investing in the space sector. Today, there are over 70 countries, and shortly, we should reach the levels of 80 countries investing in space. Canada and U.S. have leadership positions, and many of these new countries are looking to us for support and lessons learned. These privileged positions that we both have as experienced spacefaring nations allow us to shape the future of international space programs and continue with international collaboration as the centerpiece for success. But governments are not the only major players anymore. Over 80% of global space revenues are generated by the private sector. The cost of launch is falling, and the increasing ability to use off-the-shelf technologies is rapidly changing space business models and shaping private sector enterprises. Commercial space is pushing the limits, making space more accessible through emerging opportunities, new applications, innovations, and entrepreneurship. In Canada, the space manufacturing industry is 8 times more R&D intensive than the average manufacturing sector. That's quite an achievement. Following the large investments of the telecommunication industry in GEO, we're now seeing rapid growth of new investments in LEO. Industry is reshaping the way space is being explored and utilized. In part, Canada's vision for space is founded on this, the private sector taking the lead, boldly innovating where no one has innovated before. Space is a catalyst for invention. It attracts bold, creative, and resourceful minds. Rising to the challenge of space pushes the limits of what is possible. Just look at what is happening on the International Space Station right now. So on Monday, this coming Monday, on September 10th, Japan will launch its HTV resupply capsule to the International Space Station, and the Canadarm will be grabbing it and docking it to the ISS. We've gotten used to that. We've seen thousands of pictures of that. But you know what? The Canadarm was never designed to do that. So it serves as a very, very good example of how human ingenuity and strong technical capabilities can come together and help us create things that were never meant to be. So Canadarm, again, being a really great example of how we can push the limits of our technology and our human creativity. So the US is now leading the way to the moon as a stepping stone to deeper exploration. For current and future generations, these future missions will redefine what is possible and inspire in a way that hasn't been seen since the end of the Apollo program. Canada is preparing for potential roles in the Lunar Gateway. We are advancing technologies that are needed by the partnership in areas of strength for Canada, like robotics. Canada has been investing in research in artificial intelligence for over a decade, and we have created world-class centers of excellence in AI. For space applications, CSA is already working on bringing a degree of autonomy to Canadarm2 on the ISS and Dexter operations on the ISS. In the near future, Canada's new robotic system for deep space will be AI-based. The Gateway in lunar orbit will be uncrewed for long periods of time, and there will be communication delays with Earth. The next generation of space robots will have to work autonomously using artificial intelligence to perform operations in deep space. We're also exploring less traditional areas such as medicine and telemedicine. Although our focus is on areas of the economy with commercial benefit, like AI and robotics, we must also balance the private interest of business with the public interest of Canada. We are a vast country with remote communities scattered across harsh lands. The advances we make in telemedicine and supporting the space program will have a concrete benefit here on Earth. Over 200,000 households located in rural and remote areas of Canada are connected to the internet via satellite. 77 Indigenous communities in northern Canada rely solely on satellite links, which is critical for connecting households to schools, banks, and medical centers. The use of telemedicine in northern Canada, in the northern Canadian region, is 15 times higher than in dense urban areas. So you can see the importance of making great progress in telemedicine. Partnership is critical. Our future in space engages humanity in very large and complex endeavors that will require the talent and resources of the international community. International collaboration provides opportunities for countries like Canada to participate in these awe-inspiring programs. In return, the partnership benefits from our respective critical expertise. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a few examples. Canada has studied the atmosphere by contributing the MOPIT instrument to NASA's Terra satellite. The MOPIT instrument has been making long-term global measurements of carbon monoxide concentrations since its launch in 1999. Our meteorological, that's a difficult word for a Frenchman, our meteorological instruments detected snow falling on Mars with NASA's Phoenix mission. As part of NASA's OSIRIS-REx mission, as was mentioned earlier, Canada contributed a LiDAR instrument to map the Bennu asteroid. We're also part of the James Webb Space Telescope. We provided the critical guidance sensor that will help point the telescope to the farthest realms of the universe. Considering the small scope of our space program, Canada would have never been able to be part of these large-scale discoveries if not for our partnership with NASA. We take pride in knowing that we are one of the few international partners entrusted with mission-critical contributions to NASA missions. U.S. companies know they can rely upon Canadian suppliers and their flight heritage. Indeed, our partnership exists beyond space exploration. We take great pride in contributing crucial data to shared priorities, such as North American and global security. Since 1995, our RadarSat-1 and 2 continuously capture images of the Earth's surface that show potential threats and contribute to maritime surveillance, disaster management, and ecosystem monitoring. In the fall of 2018, in a few months, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket will launch Canada's RadarSat Constellation mission, the next series of Canadian radar satellites that will improve further the data collection of the Earth's surface, particularly of the Arctic. For the past 5 years, the Canadian Sapphire satellite has helped improve the U.S. space surveillance network's tracking of space traffic and debris. And since 1979, Canada has contributed to the search and rescue satellite-aided tracking system by providing near real-time signal detection of emergency distress beacons to search and rescue personnel, improving their ability to locate people and save lives. Given the rapidly changing space environment, Canada recognizes the significant need for increased international cooperation and norms of responsible behavior in space. This is essential to maintaining the sustainability, safety, and security of outer space activities and ensuring continued access to space benefits to our societies. To this end, we have been working closely with the U.S. as an active member of the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to develop a compendium of voluntary best practice guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, in addition to the debris mitigation guidelines adopted in 2007. We're very pleased to say that the work on long-term sustainability guidelines was a great success, with the committee agreeing to 21 guidelines this year alone. Having passed the copious chairmanship to Mexico, we are now looking forward to working with the U.S. and other international partners to begin their voluntary implementation. Canada has the enviable position of having a very long collaborating relationship with the U.S. in space. In fact, our partnership began almost 56 years ago when the U.S. launched Canada's first satellite studying space weather and the ionosphere. The launch, in exchange for data, made Canada the third nation in space, marking the birth of Canada's space program. The relationship, stemming from Alouette's launch, flourished into a series of science collaborations, followed by the Canadarm on a space shuttle, and an invitation to fly astronauts as part of the shuttle program. And in 1985, as Mac has alluded to, President Reagan invited Canada to join the International Space Station. To date, Canadians have flown on 16 missions, including our country's Governor General, Julie Payette, who worked as a scholar at the Wilson Center from 2011 to 2013. Today, we prepare for the next Canadian to fly in December, and that will be David Saint-Jacques. Canadarm2 was used on almost every station assembly mission, and along with Dexter, still maintains the ISS. These robots serve as the hands and eyes of teams of engineers on the ground at both the Johnson Space Center in Houston and the Remote Robotics Mission Control in Saint-Hubert, Canada. Two teams that work seamlessly together to operate a robotic system orbiting 370 kilometers overhead. On November 20th, we will mark the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station. 20 years of peaceful international collaboration in the largest and arguably the most complex engineering project in the history of humanity. 20 years of breakthrough science in service of life on Earth. And 20 years of using robots in service of the human crew on board, reducing the need for risky spacewalks, reducing the risk for our human explorers. With these first 2 decades behind us, we know that we need to think about our future steps beyond the International Space Station. We consider the ISS as a key stepping stone for future exploration destinations, helping us to learn how to live and work in space. Our countries have and will achieve great things that change history. But on a personal note, I'm also particularly proud of the opportunities we provide to young people. From supporting students with space projects to sending astronauts to talk to students in school. The International Space Education Board was established in 2005, spiriting in a new era of global collaboration in space education. The Canadian Space Agency and NASA were among the 4 founding members, along with ESA and JAXA. The objective is to share best practices and unite efforts to foster interest in space, science, and technology among the student community worldwide. 13 years later, the leadership in this area shown by Canada, the U.S., and others continues to make a difference in inspiring the next generation of space scientists and entrepreneurs. It's one thing to shape students' careers by giving them the skills they need for the job market of the future. You also have to inspire them to follow their dreams. That is perhaps one of the most powerful underlying social benefits of space exploration. Our long partnership with NASA has provided ample opportunities for inspiration, from scientific discoveries to technological achievements and Canadians in space. We've always tried to invest in areas of Canadian strengths and priorities that are valuable contributions to our partners and the international community writ large. This model has led to mission-critical and visible contributions that create a great return for everyone involved. We're looking forward to continuing our journey of studying our planet, exploring the universe, and continuing to push the boundaries of exploration with our strongest partner, the United States of America. Thank you very much.
All right, come on back. Let's have a chat. Thank you, Sylvain, and thank you, Mac. So, the U.S. administrator managed to wiggle out of this, but he's a former politician and not an engineer. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Laporte, is there life on Mars?
Oh, that's unfair. Starting the questions that way.
I'm kidding. Okay. Canadian administrator demurs. What about, I want to ask you though about the role of government in space exploration. Being the devil's advocate here, we've got all sorts of private sector organizations lining up to enter the space field, already in the space field. Why are governments and government leadership important to this endeavor?
Well, I guess there's a few ways to respond to that, and I guess from a first principles perspective, we're not in competition. In fact, throughout the history of space discoveries and space innovation, governments have always collaborated with universities and with industry. So what we have now is of course a dialing up of that, and a lot of new business models, a lot of new ways that industry is now going autonomously to space without governments. From my perspective, and it's probably a personal perspective that I know many people will share, but I see it as a great opportunity. And it's up to us in government to make sure that as we go further, because we all share a mandate of developing our national economies as well, that we leverage every possible opportunity that we can have to adapt our business models, to innovate in the way that we push the envelope of cooperation further so that we get better success. There's no monopoly of creative minds anywhere. So the more that we can leverage from each other, I think the better we have, the better the chance we have of mission success. So I'm actually looking very, very forward to trying out new, novel ways to develop things for space and to innovate going forward.
Great. Now, Mac, I want to throw that over to you too, because you've watched this over a long period of time, from a period of time when governments were absolutely essential. I'm saying, why don't we throw them off the bus, or off the shuttle, as it were? What do you think? Why is government still important in these endeavors?
Well, I think government, as Sylvain has said, play a critical role in deciding what it is we want to do and where we want to go and how we want to do these things. One of the tenets of the Canadian space program has always been that we will do space activities to meet the needs of the nation, however you define those, but we will do it in a way where we contribute to the development of an international competitive space industry. And so this cooperation that Sylvain talks about is fundamental to the way the Canadian space program has operated in the past, and I assume will operate in the future. So government takes a lead in Canada anyways in deciding what it is we want to do with space. And then the function of the Canadian Space Agency and other organizations in Canada is to ensure that the way in which we follow that direction brings the economic and social benefits that the government's expect to receive from their investment.
Great, thank you. Sylvain, I've been told I have to ask you to speak closer to the mic, but I won't ask you any really hard questions. We're at the Canada Institute in the Wilson Center, and what we do all day, every day, is talk about the importance of the relationship. Can you just, I mean, you gave some great examples in your presentation, but can you just underscore for us the importance of U.S. leadership in space and why Canada works well with the United States?
Well, when you look at the relative sizes of each one of our countries, clearly, you know, you've got the United States up here and you've got Canada down here. Same goes with respect to space. I mean, our relative economies are quite different, and our national priorities can also be slightly different as well. So what the relationship allows us to do, those that are at a lower status in terms of budgets and whatnot, the cooperation with the U.S. Allows us to get into missions that we would never have been able to participate before. And the way that the models have evolved over time, typically we have a barter kind of an arrangement for each one of these collaborations. So, you know, Canada would have a particular niche of expertise, and we would provide that to a particular mission in exchange for data that then Canadian scientists would have access to in a privileged fashion. So that kind of quid pro quo is clearly a win-win proposition. But it also, from a Canadian perspective, allows us to get access to data in science that we would have never been able to get access to before. So it provides a privileged access benefit as we look at moving forward. So that model has been used extensively over time, and as we face, you know, new ways of doing business, we're going to have to look at new ways of collaborating and looking at different types of business models going forward as well.
I'm going to ask Mac the same question. Why is U.S. leadership important in these new endeavors?
Well, I think Sylvana said mostly the key things. I will mention a couple. One thing that strikes me in what I have seen over the decades is not only do we have a very solid technical background, common background between Canada and the United States, there is a very strong political overlay in terms of this cooperation. And it's very clear to me that Canada became part of the International Space Station program for political reasons. With the major thrust of a major international foreign policy statement by Ronald Reagan, and Ambassador Beggs coming around and talking to us, was very key to this. And so what I see between Canada and the United States is a very common understanding of government and its relationship to the private sector, and we have common values in the two countries in terms of how we want to use space, how we see space as for peaceful purposes. One side story I'll tell you is in the negotiations of the agreements with on the International Space Station. One of the original sticking points was whether or not the space station would be used for, quotes, peaceful purposes. And this became a stumbling block for quite a while, and it was eventually resolved. And it was resolved in a fashion that allowed all the other international partners, including Canada, to join. And here we have an example of how the United States is capable of if they have an objective in mind, which was international cooperation on space station, they were able to find a way through this knot of peaceful use of the International Space Station so that the other countries could join. And so it's that leadership on the part of the United States. It's not only money, it is an approach, it is a technology, it's a common history, and it is a common set of values.
Excellent. That's perfectly summarizes, I think, where we wanted to go with this panel. From Mr. Bridenstine and now Mr. Laporte. This is our sort of major governmental presentation, and we're going to move on to hearing from our first panel, which is civilian space, communications, Earth observation, scientific research. But I think it bears carrying with us through the rest of the day the importance in this relationship on common values, our privileged access and understanding of each other, and our shared commitment to cooperation and excellence in results. So please join me in thanking Mr. Laporte and Mr. Evans. Thank you.